Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm going to go into the share screen mode here, and I will put this on full screen so that you'll be able to see me here. All right, so we are going to be talking about food and biochemistry, and the origin of this really is the fact that for my years of teaching at the university, biochemistry was one of my major courses. This was an introductory course for all of the people going into the molecular and biology side of chemistry, of biology rather. And I found that what really helped to make the students more interested in the biochemistry was if I included a lot of references to food, because biochemistry is all about food and how we process it, etc. And so taking material from those lectures, I put together this course. Okay, and it's very much the same. Oh, I'm going to go into the
before Christmas, and even if there was immediate
here, I'm going to need to mute all here.
Yes, please.
Okay, so I'll go into participants and mute all. Okay. All right, and back to share screen. Okay, so here we go. So, interesting way to start this is thinking of what is in food and what is it that we really need to get out of our food. It's the story of Plumpy'Nut. So what is Plumpy'Nut? Well, while doing some investigation on this a few years back, during the presidential election with all the furor about Hillary Clinton's emails, one of Hillary's emails from her was, "What is Plumpy'Nut and why do I need to know about it?" Well, it turns out Plumpy'Nut is an interesting biochemistry story. There's been a chronic problem, of course, of malnutrition, infant malnutrition, that's been with us forever. And malnourished infants had been very difficult to treat. Even if you got them to a hospital or something, the response was often to give them milk, but they had trouble digesting the milk, and you could not send them home with milk because the milk would go bad. So this French company came up with this package of ready-to-use therapeutic food. And they found that it was amazingly successful. They could take one of these packages and the children loved to eat it. And it was like a miraculous cure. Before, severely malnourished kids, 90% of them would die. And with Plumpy'Nut, 90% of them would live. And you could give them a 2-month supply. They could take it home. They didn't have to refrigerate it, and the kids would eat it avidly. So what's in it? Why is it such a great food? Well, interestingly, the main component of it is basically peanut butter. And so it had this ground up peanut paste in it, some vegetable oil, some powdered milk was worked into this paste, a little bit of sugar, and then it was fortified with various vitamins and minerals. And the whole thing cost about 60 cents. So a wonderful story of using good food biochemistry to solve a really severe problem. And so what I want to do in the course is really look into, what's the biochemistry behind these simple ingredients? And what is it that we really need to thrive and survive? And what do we do with our food? I mean, how is it digested? How is it turned into energy, etc.? All right, so let's start with how much nutrients do we really need in our food? How much do you need to grow a cell? And let's start with the simplest kinds of cells, bacterial cells. How much food do bacterial cells need? Well, the standard laboratory bacterium, that's probably the world's best studied and understood organism, E. coli, can be grown on the following list of chemicals. So as its food, it really only needs one energy source. So what typically people use is sugar. A simple sugar is just glucose. And the other things it needs some basic chemical elements. So it needs sodium, it needs phosphate, potassium, ammonium, chloride, a little bit of salt here, sodium chloride. Interestingly, bacteria need this, but we don't. We can live on a completely sodium-free diet. Magnesium, sulfate, and calcium. And this is it. The bacterial cells are amazingly sophisticated in terms of their biochemistry. After all, E. coli has 4,000 genes. It's not that simple an organism. And what these genes code for are the enzymes that can use glucose and combine it with, let's say, ammonia and make an amino acid. And from the amino acids, they can make all the proteins. They can make the proteins and the 4,000 different kinds of enzymes that you need to make an E. coli cell. So what about people? Oh, and let me say, by the way, that I'm very much open to questions and interruptions. So if you really say, wait, I didn't quite understand that, feel free to unmute yourself and ask me the question. So what do human cells need? Now, good way to do this experiment is to grow human cells the same way you grow E. coli on a petri dish. And many years ago, decades ago, we learned that, in fact, you can take a little piece of human tissue, you could take a little piece of your finger or a little piece from the inside your cheek and put it on a petri dish, just an agar medium, and it will grow. You'll get a little mound of cells that'll grow, a little mound of yourself growing in tissue culture, we call this procedure. But a lot of experiments have been done to see what food do these cells need. Are human cells as biochemically competent as those bacteria cells are, the E. coli? And the answer is not quite. We need about 60 different kinds of molecules, whereas bacteria, as I said, really only need a sugar and some salts. So what do human cells need? Well, first of all, if you're going to grow those cells, typically you would put a mix of all of the 20 amino acids. These are the molecules that are used to make protein. And in one of our lectures, we're going to focus on protein. And so we'll look at what amino acids are chemically. And 10 of those are essential, meaning we do not have the biochemistry in our bodies to make them. We must get them from our food, whereas bacteria can make all 20 from scratch. Secondly, we need a purine and a pyrimidine for the synthesis of nucleotides. Now, nucleotides are the molecules that make up DNA and RNA. When we talk about genes making A, C, T, and G, those are just symbols for 4 different types of nucleotides. And those that have 1 ring are purine nucleotides, and those that have 2 rings are pyrimidine nucleotides. But basically, these molecules in DNA and RNA, the basic building blocks for these, we cannot synthesize them. We have to get them in our diet if you want to grow cells in culture. Now, thirdly, we need these 2 components, inositol and choline, to make phospholipids. These are the molecules that make all the membranes that surround the cells in our body. So these membranes are essential because they keep the good things in and the bad things out, and transport in and out of the membrane is highly regulated in terms of what can get in, what can get out of our cells. And so you need this very specific bilayer of these lipid molecules in the membranes. We need 8 vitamins. I'm going to tell you what those are. Coenzyme leukoic acid is kind of it's really a vitamin. It's just you need it a little bit higher amounts than you do the other vitamins. And then there are basic elements salts really that you have to have: sodium, potassium, phosphorus, chlorine, calcium, copper, zinc, and cobalt. And there are even a few rather rare elements, I mean, things like vanadium or whatever, that you need in tiny quantities. Often you don't even have to add these to growing cells in culture because they're present as contaminants in the other kinds of molecules that you add. So what it comes down to is for human cells, we can make a lot of different kinds of molecules. I mean, we have maybe a need for something in the order of 25,000 different kinds of molecules to make the cells in our body. And we can make all but about 60 of them. All right. However, it's a little more complicated than that. If you do this experiment with human cells growing in a petri dish, and you add these things, they do grow, but they grow very slowly, and they don't really thrive. When people are really doing this in laboratory experiments, in fact, they enrich the medium, and the typical thing to put in there is the serum from blood. In other words, they get blood often from cows, calves. They spin out all the cells, so they just have the liquid that's left over there. And if you add that to this mound of human cells you're growing, it grows much better. So it says that there are things we need in very tiny amounts. Some of these are mixtures of these vitamins and these trace elements, and probably some of the hormones that are in this blood serum are important too. So in principle, we don't require very many things, but in practice, to thrive, we really need a more complicated diet. We need more nutritional items in our food. Okay, so to help you understand some of the biochemistry we're going to talk about this, we're going to have just a little bit of a chemistry lesson here. This is going to be some of the only really hardcore going back to your high school chemistry that we're going to do. So our cells, our bodies are made predominantly of just 4 elements: hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. That probably makes up, 98% of everything that's not bones. We also have to have a lot of calcium because we have bones. But you looked at a mass of human cells growing in culture in a petri dish, about these 4 elements would constitute 98% of the total. And so let's just look at the chemistry of these 4 elements. So you have your basic kind of model cartoon of what an atom looks like. So an atom will have a nucleus in the center with protons and neutrons. And then circling it will be the electrons. Now I must say that for people who really know chemistry, etc., they've come to look at this sort of cartoon as not only wrong, but almost, bad way to present it, because it's not really like this. What it's really like, the structure of an atom, it's really like the quantum mechanical world. And so you go into the particle wave duality of electrons. I mean, electrons are really a probability cloud circling the protons. But that's a really difficult concept to grasp. I tell you, in all of my years of biochemistry, I still have no intuitive feeling of what an electron really is. And the analogy that we have here is useful. It's useful in explaining our nutrition and biochemistry. So what you have with a simple atom like hydrogen or helium is you have the nucleus and you have 1 or 2 electrons in an inner orbit. And then with the more complicated atoms, you have room out here for 8 electrons to circle the nucleus. And the most stable structure for all of these elements is to have 8 electrons in the outer shell. Now, the way they come is hydrogen only has 1, so it would like to get a second electron circling it. Carbon has 4, so it would like to get 4 more to make 8. Nitrogen has 5, it would like to get 3 more to get 8. And oxygen has 6, so it would like to get 2 more to make 8. And so if we look at this rule of thumb that you want to get 8 electrons circling the atom, you understand the structure of kind of the most common molecules that we encounter in our bodies. So hydrogen, being the smallest atom, needs to pair with something that will donate 1 other electron, and that's hydrogen. And so most hydrogen atoms exist as a pair, H2. This is hydrogen gas. Nitrogen, on the other hand, has 5 electrons, so to make 8, it needs to add 3 hydrogens. And this is ammonia. And ammonia is used as a fertilizer. It is the best way in living organisms to have a molecule that can be used as the source of nitrogen to make molecules like amino acids and nucleotides that have to have nitrogen. Okay, carbon has 4, and this is why life exists, that carbon can bind to 4 different kinds of molecules that can donate electrons. And so it allows it to form a huge variety of different atomic combinations, and it allows it to make long chains. And this is going to be one of the theme of the biochemistry of food here. So in order to satisfy its need for 8 electrons, it will bind 4 protons, and what you get is CH4. This is methane. This is what natural gas is. So it is so abundant in the world, both from fossil fuels and from the emissions from cows and from us and everything that metabolizes food. That's why this is so abundant, because of this stable form of carbon in which it's bound 4 hydrogens to make 8 electrons in its outer shell. And then lastly, of course, water needs to have 2 electrons. So it binds 2 protons and you get H2O. So you get water. So it all works out. I remember when I was first taking chemistry in high school, and they're explaining this pattern of why the molecules have this stoichiometry of 3 hydrogens per 1 nitrogen. I thought, well, that's pretty cool. It all makes sense, actually. So just to kind of sum it up, here is a slightly more complicated molecule. This is an amino acid, the simplest of all the amino acids, called glycine. It's called an amino acid because it has an amino group on this end, and it has an acid group on this end, all right? And there's a carbon in the middle that holds the amino and the acid group together in the molecule. So you can see that our chemical stoichiometry works out. Nitrogen is supposed to bind to 3 things to fill its shell of 8 electrons. So it binds 2 hydrogen and it binds a carbon. Carbon needs to bind 4 things. So it binds a hydrogen here, the amino group, and the carboxyl group. This carbon needs to bind 4 things. So it forms a double bond with oxygen. Oxygen needs to bind 2 things. So they're both satisfied here. Oxygen gets its 2, carbon gets 2 of these, and it gets 2 more from these other atoms. And lastly, this oxygen, instead of forming a double bond, binds carbon and it binds hydrogen. So the rules work, and this is how you can understand why molecules have the combination of atoms that they do. Understanding the simple rule that these atoms want to have 8 electrons in the outer shell.
Barry, this is Naomi. Is there an example of a molecule without hydrogen?
Many, many, many. So, so for example, it's possible to form carbon with carbon and nitrogen, and what you get is cyanide. Cyanide is CN. So yes, all the other combinations are possible, but you have to keep the most stable ones are when you form this outer shell of 8 electrons. Now that does not always have to be the case, but if you make a molecule that only has 7 electrons in its outer shell, it is very reactive because it still wants, in anthropomorphic terms here, wants another electron. But almost all the combinations you can think of are possible and exist in terms of small molecules. Any other questions about this? All right, so that's kind of the chemistry we're going to go into here. So let's go back, looking at food on a larger scale. One main theme that I want to really hammer home is that all of our food essentially comes from cells in the end. We're eating either cells or we're eating cells that have been processed in some ways. And so let's just look a little bit at, this is a plant cell where it's been, a slice of the cell has been looked at in an electron microscope. And this is an animal cell. And these two different kinds of cells are more similar than they are different. So the major difference is that plant cells often have a very thick wall around the exterior, all right? And this is where a lot of the fiber in our food comes from. So when you talk about eating a food that has a high fiber content, that fiber is largely these thick walls that protect the plant cell. Animal cells don't have that. You see, this is the boundary between two cells here, and you don't see, there's no thick wall in there. And the reason for that is these cells are living in the very safe environment within our bodies. They are not out exposed to the natural world the way a lot of plant cells are. Second major difference is that plant cells, if this were a leaf of lettuce, for example, we would look at it and find that most of it is this big open watery compartment within the cell called the vacuole. These kinds of open watery compartments don't exist within, rarely exist within animal cells. But if we actually look at all of the stuff here that makes up the cells, these are different organelles. These are the mitochondria. There will be a nucleus. There will be other organelles. These structures and the proteins and other molecules that make them are very, very similar in plant cells and in animal cells. And so when we eat our food, this is the material that we're eating. And so we want to take a look at to see what is this material really. All right. So let's to kind of zoom in on it as best we can. Now, this picture taken with this electron microscope, this is about as good as we can get in terms of actually visualizing the molecules within the cell. And yet we cannot see atoms. We cannot really see even individual proteins other than maybe the smallest little dot in here might be an individual protein, but that protein would be made up of 10,000 to 100,000 atoms. So let's say that we were able to zoom in on a little place here. This is a nucleus of an animal cell. And this is the cytoplasm, and there are pores in here. So let's say we just took a little box here. If we could zoom in on that, what would it really look like? And it would look kind of like this. What's been done here is, so scientists have tried to draw a picture of the insides of a cell, having the size of all of the molecules be as accurate as possible. So that tiny little space in the cell now allows us to see individual proteins. So if we could really look inside a cell and see what it is that we are eating, the first made impression is that it is a very complicated, dense mix of many, many different kinds of molecules. And in fact, the typical cell has probably at least 100,000 different kinds of molecules. All right, so much of what you see here is proteins. So like the green things are all supposed to be one kind of proteins, the blue, the red. Now, these are false colors, of course. If you actually look in a cell, very few of the proteins are colored at all, and they would be transparent, all right, you know, or just in black and white. But they've colored them here to make them more visible. Now, what are these compartments here? Well, this is the biological membrane, and they're made up of a relative of fat molecules, lipid molecules. Their chemical properties are that lipids, as you know from the kitchen, don't dissolve in water. Lipids tend to stick to other lipid molecules. And that chemical property is why membranes form. So you get a layer of lipids. It's not really like a piece of paper. It's more like a layer of oil, really, but it forms a barrier which keeps some things inside a compartment and other things outside a compartment. So it allows you to sequester certain kinds of chemical reactions in a closed space within the cell. Now, this is a pore that allows the cytoplasm out here to send molecules into the nucleus in here and vice versa. So this side of this membrane is the nucleus. This side out here is the cytoplasm. And so inside the nucleus, you have the DNA. This is where your genes are. And so this twisted helix here in blue, that's showing the relative size of what the DNA would look like. And this DNA is being read by an enzyme. That's this clump of proteins here. And as the enzyme chugs along the DNA here, it copies it into a molecule of RNA. And that's what this RNA is here. And this RNA will exit the nucleus through this pore. Here's the RNA outside, and the RNA will be bound by a complex that allows it to be read to make protein. So anyway, that process is something I talked about in my other OLLI course, which is on molecular biology and how DNA makes RNA makes protein, the basic way in which cells form themselves. But for our viewpoint today, all this is just food. It's just food because we can use the protein and the other material in here to grow the cells in our own body. Now, so a couple of generalizations from this is that if we look in the tissues of most plant and animal cells, much of what we see is protein. What about sugars and carbohydrates? Well, in the plant cells, the wall is largely made up of carbohydrate, but most of it we can't digest. As I said, that's where the fiber comes in our diet. What can digest that fiber are all of the microorganisms that live in our digestive system. And one of the lectures I'm going to be talking about that are biota, or microbiome is the word I want to use. But in cells, there's not that much carbohydrate. Some of these protein molecules have sugars attached to them. They can be either forming kind of addresses on the protein such that after they're made, the address might say, take me inside this organelle or leave me outside here. They can serve as tags that allows the cell apparatus to know what to do with a protein in the building of a cell. And there's some evidence that they kind of protect the proteins against degradation. Now, in terms of fats, lipids, well, we know that the membranes here are made out of lipids. So when we eat these cells, we do get some lipid from them, but there's not a lot of it. It's mostly protein. So where in fact then do we get all of the carbohydrate and the lipid in our diet? All right, if it's not from the typical cell. Okay, and the answer is that although I say that, it's important to remember that ultimately we're eating cells of other organisms as our food. Most of our food energy, our calories, comes from cells that are specialized for storage and that look a little bit different from those typical cells that I just showed you in those electron micrographs. So most of our food come from? It comes from the seeds of plants ultimately. So rice, corn, wheat, things like peanuts, and then a lot of seeds that produce not so much carbohydrates like rice, corn, wheat, it's mostly starch, but there are lots of seeds like rapeseed, also called canola, which produce a lot of oil. And then when we eat animals in our diet, we're primarily focused really on cells that are primarily muscle and cells that have stored a lot of fat. So if you look at these cells, they're still cellular, but they're different in that they are just loaded with these compartments that are just almost pure fat molecules. There's a lot of fat under the skin. So if you eat chicken, for example, a lot of the flavor and the calories in the chicken is in the fat that's in the skin. Or in some organ foods, like often I think a lot of us probably remember when we were kids, you would eat things like cod liver oil, or that liver is supposed to be particularly good for you, which it is, right? But the liver is the major organ in our body that processes all of our food, all right? And because of that, it has a little more carbohydrate in it, but it also has a real mix of all of the things we need to make the molecules in our body. All right, so I just want to say a little bit about the kind of biochemistry and structure of these important seeds that constitute 80% of the calories that we eat. So much of what we eat is made with flour, and most of our flour comes from wheat. And it's useful to know what a wheat seed really looks like. The flour that we eat in our food makes up about 75%, about 3/4 of the mass of a wheat seed. But what's the other 25% in the wheat seed? Well, remember that the biology of this is that it's basically a little wheat plant embryo, an incipient little infant wheat, if you will, with the storage supply of nutrients that this little wheat plant is going to need to germinate and survive. And so what you have in a wheat seed is this very specialized tissue called the endosperm, which starts out as a normal looking cell, but then focuses all of its energy on making primarily starch, and until the cell is just packed with little granules of starch inside every little cell. And then the last step in the maturation of a wheat seed is these cells actually die. A lot of the other nutrients are mobilized into the growing little wheat embryo. And you're left with pretty much a dried package, which is 90% starch, carbohydrate, and about 10% protein. In the case of wheat, most of that protein is gluten, the gluten protein. All right. So when they mill wheat, what happens is the seed is kind of broken without being ground to a fine powder in the first step. And when they break it, they separate this part here, the little incipient wheat plant, which is wheat germ. Wheat germ is basically you're eating little plant embryos. And the second part is this tough outer covering of the wheat seed. This is the bran. And then what's left is this hard kernel of the starch on the inside. So if you get whole wheat flour, that is made by taking the whole wheat seed and grinding it up. All right. Now, sometimes it can be processed a little bit. Why don't we just eat the whole seed, especially given the fact that a lot of the nutrients are down here in this plant embryo? Why did we start getting rid of all the good stuff, if you will, and just saving this stuff here? Well, there's a very good practical reason for it, in that the wheat germ, etc., just does not store well. It's a little bit wet. It has a lot of molecules that are highly reactive with oxygen, so it gets oxidized. And so it was discovered many thousands of years ago that if you separate the germ and the bran from this, you can store wheat for years, literally, under the right conditions, and it will still be good to eat. But if you just ground up the whole wheat seed and stored it, it will go rancid on you starting within weeks, and certainly within a few months. All right. But that's why you sometimes get whole wheat flour. If you have bran flakes, it means that they've added a lot of this outer covering of the wheat to the flakes. And that's a different thing you can do with wheat seed to make food with different nutritional composition. Any question about this part here? Okay, so as I said, important to know that 80% of all human caloric intake these days is really just these three major crops: rice, corn, and wheat. So, you see stories sometimes these days of, new high-tech agriculture where they're going to grow everything inside. You're going to take a shipping container, you're going to have artificial lights, and you grow everything you need. Well, that will work for things like lettuce, crops that are primarily just kind of like enriched water for the most part. But in order for the human race to survive, in the United States, we have 110 million acres of corn. We have an equivalent 110 million acres of wheat. And we just need these crops that have taken that sunlight and the CO2 from the atmosphere and made this concentrated starch solution, which we can use as energy for our nutritional needs. And it's just the major part of our intake of food. And then this is, of course, mostly starch containing seeds. Peanuts, for example, and the reason they're used in Plumpy'Nut is because peanuts have starch, but they also have a lot of protein, and they also have a lot of oil. Where do you get peanut oil from? You get it from peanuts. And then other seeds specialize in storing all of the energy needs of the new plant, not in starch, but in a lot of oil. So rapeseed would be one. Another major agricultural crop now, has good things and bad things for it, is oil palms. You've probably heard about how vast acres of tropical rainforest are being cut down to plant oil palm plantations. That's because these palm trees will produce seeds with very high yields that contain large amounts of oil that can be used both for food sources and for other sources. And as I said before, in animal cells, much of the nutrition and energy we get from is specialized cells, and mostly we eat the muscle cells of most animals. Okay, questions
I have
there?
a question.
Yes.
Yeah, if we go back, I would think we'd see, well, a lot of the corn, say, at least, goes into feeding animals. And then you have a fairly major crop in soybeans that you didn't mention that is also used a whole lot in animal feed. So I just, I don't know, I was wondering about what the role and the the amount of that goes into animal feed and
Yeah, that's a very good point, Mark. And this 80% number is a sort of global population number. And of course, in much of the Western world, of course, we have a lot of animal meat in our diet. And you are exactly right that animal meat is produced largely from feeding the animals on soybeans and on corn. So most of the corn crop in the United States goes to three places. Some of it we eat, all right, but a lot of it goes to feeding to animals, and then a lot of it, something in the neighbor of 30 to 40% of all the corn we grow is now converted to ethanol, which goes into our cars. So the energy sources produce ethanol. And we won't get into it here, but there's a lot of good science to say that that is a very inefficient use of this resource. Takes a lot of water and the yield is poor to convert corn into ethanol for fuel, as I think you would probably know well also. But good point. But globally, of course, if you've ever been to Africa, many of the people in Africa, the main subsistence source of nutrition for them is cornmeal. They eat it 3 times a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It's kind of cornmeal supplemented with a little bit of vegetable and a little bit of wheat. And of course, rice is a major crop in much of the world. So this is kind of a global population issue here. All right, but I'm glad you mentioned the soybeans, especially as a huge agricultural industry in the US and around the world, and nowadays, especially in Brazil. Okay, so to keep my students paying attention to my lectures when I was doing this at UCSC, I would bring in a real Big Mac and say, you're all biochemists, incipient biochemists. What would a biochemist's view be of a Big Mac? And let me say that this is not going to be a Big Mac diatribe. This is actually fairly decent food. The problem with this is not what's in it, it's what it's deficient in. So if you look at a Big Mac, what's wrong with this Big Mac? Well, the main thing that's wrong with it is how much greenery is there in here? There's a little tidbit here, there's a little bit tidbit here. It has about 1% of your daily required vegetable in it. All right. But I worked at McDonald's for my first 2 years of college, all right? And I used to ask my students how many of them worked at McDonald's, and 40 years ago when I started, I would find that maybe 20, 30% of the class had worked at McDonald's. Now, interesting, the last years I taught my class, there was almost nobody. Gets off into a completely different subject when you ask, why are the students who are sitting in college classrooms at UCSC different from the students, or not the students, the young people who are working at McDonald's? Maybe when we finish this lecture, I'd be curious as to whether anybody else ever worked at McDonald's. All right, well, what's in a Big Mac? What's a biochemist's view of a Big Mac? So let's start with the top part here. If you go to McDonald's website, they will give you detailed information on everything that goes to making this. So first of all, you have the Big Mac bun. So what's in a Big Mac bun? Okay, here's the information straight off of McDonald's website. And what you see is that it is a pretty complicated construction. here making this Big Mac bun. So these nutrition labels generally follow certain rules, and one of the rules is that the ingredients are listed in order of abundance. So the things that come first are what make up the bulk of it, and the things that come last are the things that are present in rather tiny amounts. Let's just look at what's in it. So what we have first is enriched bleached wheat flour. All right, so we just looked at a wheat seed. And what does this mean? Well, it's wheat flour in which they have removed the bran, they have removed the wheat germ, and they're just focusing on the starch component. It's about 80% starch and 20% things like gluten and just a little bit of lipid in there. It has been bleached, and this has been common for decades, and in the US especially, because if it's not bleached, it will oxidize and go rancid. All right, but it's also enriched. And what does that mean? Well, the main thing it's enriched in are these 5 molecules here: thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, iron, and folic acid. Well, we know what iron is. That's an element, and we know that iron is needed to make hemoglobin, among other things, in our blood. But what are these other molecules? Well, they're vitamins. So it's a vitamin-enriched flour. And let me just say at this point that the use of enriched flour in the US and around the world is a very good thing. And something I was reading recently, and this will come up as we talk about these different vitamins, is that because milled wheat flour has none of the germ in it, or none of the outer layers covering, most of the vitamins have been removed from the wheat seed when flour is made. And in the past, these vitamin deficient diets were a very bad thing for people. So for example, I read recently that in the 1920s, 75% of the infants born in New York City from some old records, 75% had rickets. You know, this just a nutrient deficiency that causes abnormal bone development. And the development of enriched flours has basically eliminated a lot of these nutritional deficiencies, at least in the Western world. There's still parts of the world where this is a big problem. All right, so what is a vitamin anyway? Well, here's a good definition. It's any of a group of organic compounds, and organic here is a word used by chemists that's very different. We're not talking about organic food. That has to do with a set of policies pertaining to the type of pesticides and fertilizers that can be used. An organic compound to a chemist is a compound that contains carbon plus hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, like those molecules we talked about in our little earlier chemistry section. So almost all of our bodies are made up of the kinds of molecules that are called organic molecules, basically carbon-based compounds. And they are essential for normal growth and nutrition, and they are required in small quantities in the diet because they cannot be synthesized by the body. So vitamins are things we need in small amounts. We must have them, but we can't make them. And here are these examples that you find in the Big Mac bun. So first of all, on the list there was a thiamine. Well, that's also known as vitamin B1. So it's one of the first vitamins found. And this is an example of the structure of thiamine. Now, they're using a chemist convention here where rather than putting down a C where all the carbons are. It's just wherever there's an intersection of lines, that's a carbon. So this is a ring of carbon molecules, a little chain of carbon, and it has these extra hydrogens and nitrogens incorporated into the molecule. So a fairly small molecule and yet rather complex with combinations of double and single bonds, etc. To make this kind of molecule from scratch, from sugar and from ammonia and from hydrogen, probably requires about 15 different chemical steps. And to make it in a living organism would take about 15 different enzymes. Bacteria and plants have all of these enzymes. They can make thiamine from scratch. Animal cells, us, most mammals, most animals, no longer bother to make these 15 different kinds of enzymes. It takes a certain amount of energy and a certain amount of the cell's resources to make a molecule like this. So we no longer have the genes to make it. Instead, we just eat other cells where it's already present. So instead of making it, we just eat it. And cereal grains are a good source of thiamine. If you don't have thiamine, you get this disease beriberi, which has all sorts of developmental symptoms. And the reason you have to have it is because it's essential for sugar metabolism. Now, let me just show you one cartoon here to kind of illustrate what a vitamin is and what it has to do. So let's say we take a molecule like table sugar, sucrose, and we've had a sugary drink and we've just drank some sucrose. What our body needs to use that sucrose is, first of all, sucrose is a disaccharide. It has two pieces to it, and we need to split it apart. So we have an enzyme that will do that. This is a big protein. The sucrose will sit in this space in the enzyme, and then the chemical reactivity of this will split it into two pieces. For some of the reactions, however, the atoms in the protein are not able to do some specific types of chemical reactions, and so they need some extra complicated organic molecule to bind to the protein, and these are called coenzymes or cofactors, and that's what vitamins are. So you could have an enzyme that would bind to thiamine, it would fit into a pocket on this protein, and now the combination of the thiamine and the protein can do chemistry on some other molecule that could not be done just by the protein itself. So they're kind of little active, kind of engineered components that we get from other animals that we combine with a certain subset of our protein. So in our body, there are 25,000 different kinds of enzymes. Thiamine only binds to 3 or 4 of those, just a few rare enzymes that need the thiamine to do the chemistry. That's how all of the vitamins work. Riboflavin, vitamin B2. The naming, by the way, vitamin A, vitamin B, etc., it's really historical, more in order of how they were found than any kind of chemical explanation for the nomenclature. So is riboflavin. This is a more complex molecule you see here. If you were to synthesize in the lab, it would take many steps in the process. It would take many enzymes to do this. We don't make these enzymes. We don't have the genes to encode the enzymes. We just eat other cells. We eat plants to get this. Niacin, vitamin B3, that's abundant in many non-processed food. So if you don't cook the food, or if you don't remove all the good nutrients from it, you'll have a lot of niacin. It's a common element. However, if you, for example, live on a diet that is very high just in cornstarch, and both in Africa and South America, you find people who really are in poverty and cannot afford meat and vegetables and are just eating cornstarch 3 times a day, they develop this disease, pellagra, and it's a really nasty developmental disease. This niacin is a rather simple molecule. It's essential for energy metabolism. And we're going to show a little bit about how this works in our next class, where we're going to talk about energy metabolism. And then another thing they add to the Big Mac is folic acid. Very complex molecule. You see, once again, we get it from our food. It's present in dark green vegetables. You can also get it from liver. It's rather enriched. If you don't get enough of it, it causes anemia. And you may have heard about folic acid and folate deficiencies, because in the last few years, there's been quite a few stories about how this causes birth defects. If the mother is eating a diet that does not have a reasonable amount of good green vegetables in it, the folic acid deficiency will cause abnormal neural development. The spinal neural column will not close up properly. Now, I was just reading recently about why is this so? Why is this particular vitamin cause this neurological development abnormality? And the best idea right now is that folic acid is needed for an enzyme that makes nucleotides. That's DNA and RNA. And in the developing fetus, in the development of some nervous system, like the spinal column, you have periods of very rapid cell division. And every time you need to make a new cell, you need to duplicate your DNA. And if you are deficient in folic acid, you can't make the ACs and Ts and Gs at a rate fast enough. And so the development comes out to be abnormal. That's the current idea of why there's this connection. Any question there? I thought I saw a hand going up.
Question about, I found it fascinating that the naming protocols for the different vitamins based on when they were discovered. And so the B vitamins have no similarities, or?
From a biochemical point of view, no. Sometimes part of the similarities is like their solubility. So there are, water soluble vitamins and lipid soluble vitamins. And so they were grouped together in that way. And that does, it is related to their chemistry, whether they're hydrophobic or hydrophilic. But in terms of actual structure, no, they're all quite different. Yeah. Other questions?
I wanted to bring up what I think is a fascinating story about vitamin C.
Yeah.
Because all of the primates share a defective copy of a gene that would make a protein that would allow you to make vitamin C, and they all share essentially the same defect. And so I guess the explanation for that is that we have a common ancestor among the primates and a few other animals that once could make vitamin C, but then basically lost the ability through this defect. And in the environment they were living in at the time, they didn't need it. So, and then we've all inherited that same defect and lost that ability to make vitamin C. So I think that's maybe the kind of story that's happened with a lot of vitamins, where originally they could be made by organisms and they got lost along the way.
Right, and there is a plus side to losing the ability to make these vitamins, in that then you don't have to make all the enzymes and devote resources to synthesizing them yourself, as long as they're really abundant in your environment. And vitamin C is kind of, a good example. You can get vitamin C from so many things. If you're really deficient, you could just go chomping on a little bit of grass and it would do it. But if you're on a ship at the sea for 5 months, there's just nothing you can eat unless you could really, catch some birds or something that will do it. Okay, so finish out the couple of more items on the Big Mac bun. And the next thing of abundance in a Big Mac bun is high fructose corn syrup. All right, so in our next lecture, we're going to be talking about carbohydrates. You mentioned high fructose corn syrup, you go boo, because this is considered to be a really evil compound. Well, the molecules themselves it's just plain old sugar. The problem with high fructose corn syrup is we just eat too much of it, and we'll talk about this next time. Why do they use it? It's because it's cheap and it's present in liquid form, which makes it very easy to use in industrial processes. Pick out a few other things that are in here. We have a lot of this, you'll see this frequently on food labels, mono and diglycerides. And down here, tartaric acid esters of mono and diglycerides, ethoxylated mono and diglycerides. What are these molecules? Well, here's a diglyceride I show you down below. So the core of it is these 3 carbons, carbon, carbon, carbon. This is glycerol or glycerin. You've probably heard of glycerin. It's kind of a very sweet molecule. It's used in all creatures to form important molecules that make up biological membranes. So if you add this long chain, this hydrocarbon chain, to one of the carbons, you have a monoglyceride. If you add it to 2 of the carbons, you have a diglyceride. And if you add 3, you have a triglyceride, which is a fat. Now, this part of the molecule here, this hydrocarbons, just pure carbon with hydrogens attached at every possible point, this is what you put into your car if it's a gasoline-based car. This is a kind of pure, kind of octane type hydrocarbon, fossil fuel. However, it can be made from plants, and of course that's the ultimate origin of fossil fuels, is plants made these hydrocarbons, which then became petroleum, etc. Now, the interesting chemistry of this is you will notice that there is no oxygen in this part of the molecule. And we're going to revisit this story because it means that this is not very soluble in water at all. And these diglycerides have the property that most of the molecule is not soluble in water and will associate with other like molecules, other lipid-like molecules. Whereas this part down here, especially at the end here, this is very soluble in water. And so something that will dissolve in both water on one end and fat on the other end, that's basically what detergent is. It's basically what soap is. And they put this into processed foods as emulsifiers and to help the water and the oil that's added to the food blend together and not separate. It is, however, a core molecule that makes up your biological membrane. So it's not some synthetic chemical. It's a real natural molecule, and it is an excellent source of energy in your body. It's a source of fat that we'll talk about in the future. Now, last one I've got here, this is interesting, silicon dioxide. What's that? You may remember, isn't that like sand or quartz? And that's exactly right. Now, it turns out that plants, in fact, will make silicon dioxide, and it's been found that a little bit of silicon is good for the growth of plants. So at these low levels that we get it here, been pretty thoroughly tested. It's not bad for us. And what they use it for is a declumping agent. So if you have powders like flours, etc., and you don't want them all to clump together, put in a little bit of silicon dioxide, it makes them flow in industrial processing. All right, so what else is in the Big Mac? Well, the second important part is, of course, the beef patty. McDonald's is 100% pure USDA inspected beef, no additives, no fillers, no extenders. And this, of course, is the most nutritious part of the hamburger because it contains 100,000 types of molecules, and many of the things we need, all of the micronutrients are in there. So it's fundamentally a good molecule. It has its drawbacks, which we'll come to in a second. And then the third ingredient is the Big Mac sauce. And what's the most abundant thing there? Soybean oil. All right. This is kind of the oil which really gives much of the flavor to it. And then some pickles, some vinegar, water, some sugar, egg yolks. This is also another source of type of fat. And what egg yolks are rich in, of course, is cholesterol. And of course, cholesterol in our diet can be a problem if you have too much, sweetened with a little bit of high fructose corn syrup, regular corn syrup, etc. So when we look overall, what's in a Big Mac from a biochemical perspective? You've got 7.6 ounces. That's the size of a typical Big Mac. And most of that is water. All right. You dehydrated a Big Mac, it'd shrink down to less than half its size. The biochemicals that are in it are in these three major categories. So 1.2 ounces of fat. The most abundant thing in there is the carbohydrates and the sugar. So where does that come from? Well, from two sources. The bun is almost pure carbohydrate, and the oil had a lot of sugar added to it. So it's more sugar than anything else because of the bun and the sauce. All right. And then the protein, of course, comes almost entirely from the meat. Little bit of it is in the flour also. Now, one of the interesting things that I want you to think about using biochemistry to look at your food is there's less fat in there than carbohydrates, but most of the calories come from the fat. So there's 310 calories of the total calories in here. So all added up, this adds up to 590 calories, and it is mostly fat calories. And that, when people talk about Big Mac being not good for you, that is half of the problem. The other half of the problem is, as I said before, is that what's missing, of course, is if you just eat a Big Mac, there's just no vegetable component to it. And you need those micronutrients that are in the vegetables. So 180 calories in the carbohydrate, 9 ounces of protein, 100 calories in the protein. All right, so this raises the question of we always do these calorie counts on our food, but just what is a calorie anyway? And calorie is a measure of energy. And energy is such a big term in terms of thinking, what is energy really? We can get, I think, an intuitive sense of it by thinking of what the energy can do. And this is how you really actually measure a calorie. So 1 calorie in nutritional terms is the amount of molecules that will raise a liter of water by 1 degree centigrade. In science, of course, we use these metric units, but if we use it in our everyday English-based units, 1 calorie will raise 1 quart of water by 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And so a way of thinking of this is, let's say you had a little bit of oil and you put a wick in the oil and you lit it. And then on top of this flame, you had a little container of water. And as the flame heated the water, you could measure the temperature rise in the water. So what's happening here is as oxygen from the air is combining with the oil, you get a chemical reaction, and that gives off heat, and that heat heats the water, and you can measure that precisely. They do that with devices called a calorimeter. They essentially burn the food and see how much the water heats up, and that tells them how much energy was released in this chemical reaction of food plus oxygen making heat. All right, so some confusion between what chemists use and what the nutritional people use is 1 food calorie is equivalent to 1,000 chemical calories. So 1 kilocalorie in chemical usage is equal to 1 large calorie in food. And in terms of the kind of physics units, this is 4.2 joules per kilocalorie. So how much energy then in a typical diet? So kind of the low end of what we need to get by every day is 2,000 to 2,500 calories, large calorie. The human body has about 100 pounds of water in it. And so if you ate 1 day's worth of your caloric needs, which you could get in about a little over a pound of dry rice, that's what you need in terms of calories to survive every day, is something equivalent to about a pound of dried rice. That is 2,000 calories. Just how much energy is released from this? Well, if you combine it with oxygen, it produces enough heat to raise the temperature of your body to 170 degrees Fahrenheit. Kind of an interesting number. So your daily caloric intake produces this much energy. Now, obviously, your body temperature doesn't go up to 170, you would be dead. So what happens to it? Well, a part of it does go off as heat, but it's radiated over 24 hours. So a person typically runs at a power level of about equivalent to that of a 100-watt light bulb. Kind of good way to think about it. And you can think of, we've all been in rooms crowded with people, and it can get very warm in the room. And it makes sense because all of this metabolism that's going on in our body, converting our Big Mac into other kinds of molecules, releases a lot of heat. And this is the amount of heat. Every one of us kind of gives off the amount of heat of a 100-watt light bulb, which is a significant amount of heat for 24 hours a day. Now, however, when we eat a Big Mac, we don't instantly get a fever after every meal. So the question is, what happens to all of those molecules that we eat? How do we harvest this energy? And that is what we are going to talk about next time. So our next class is going to be focused on carbohydrates and focus on energy metabolism. We use these foods to allow us to think, to walk across the room, to manufacture all the parts of our body. And we will get into that in the next lecture. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and open this up for some questions. Questions from anybody here? You can unmute yourself and ask a question. All right.
Barry, one thing you mentioned early on was that a whole bunch of things were just salts, you said?
Well, that
What exactly is a salt?
so a salt chemist is I mean, basically, if you combine a positively charged atom with a negatively charged atom, like a sodium and a chloride, you get sodium chloride, that's a salt. Or a sodium and a sulfate would be sodium sulfate, that's a salt. So it's just fundamentally having two, kind of inorganic, non-carbon containing molecules. They have a plus and a minus charge. And I guess the important distinction of a salt is that if you put it into water, the pluses and the minuses will bind the plus and minus in the water molecules and they'll dissolve. Salts will dissolve in water. Whereas if you put a plus and minus together and they bind so tightly that they can't be dissolved, then they wouldn't be called a salt. It's a chemist's term.
Okay.
And literally, when you're making things in the lab, you have these bottles full of different salts that can be dissolved in water and make it easy for you to make up the desired mixes of nutrients to add to your growing cells.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Harriet.
My question had to do with some of the vegetable oils, the plant oils.
Mm-hmm.
For a long time, I associated saturated fat with animal fats, but somehow or other, it appears that coconut oil and palm oil have saturated fats. And there are even debates about their impact on the human body, nutritionists being split. So I'm wondering if you could, at some time in the future, if not now, talk about the structure of what makes a saturated fat and then its impact on the body.
I think it's either my third or fourth lecture. It's going to all be on lipids and fats, and we will talk about those issues explicitly. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions here? Okay. I guess got it all down there, Pat. So the bottom line of what the Big Mac is, if you eat a Big Mac once every couple of weeks, it's fine, but don't eat it 3 times a day. And if you maybe get a little bit of the salad with the Big Mac, and remember that more than 50% of its calories come from fat. And fat per se, as Harriet just mentioned, fat's reputation has kind of been revitalized, but still the same old story. It's not that it's bad for you, it's that too much of it is bad for you. So the calories do count. Okay, well, no more questions. Florence, you had something? Oh no, you were just waving goodbye. Okay, all right. Well, I will see you all next Tuesday then, and we'll talk about carbohydrates and energy. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barry.
Okay.